Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Kale Zelden, who is a classics professor, specifically within the realm of literature, at a prep school, Catholic prep school. In this conversation, we talk about current events and his takes on them. Found him to be a very erudite individual with a deep love of the Western tradition. You can find links to Kale's work down there in the description, as well as links to support this channel. Without further ado, here is Kale Zelden. What is your area of expertise, Kale?
Literature is my thing. I've been teaching English and Lit for over 25 years now, with a stint, with a 5-year stint away. But yeah, no, that's what I do. In the program, the class that brought me here is a kind of a great books hop, skip, and jump through the Western tradition from basically St. Paul to all the way up to James Joyce. So, get right up to the beginning of the 20th century. So that's the class that I primarily teach.
Is that class not been thoroughly outdated and undermined by the decolonization efforts of decentering that toxic male white identity that has been so formative to the evil empire of the West?
Yeah. I mean, that's what brought me here 18 years ago, which is that, I saw a school. I mean, even 18 years ago, that was pretty retrograde. It became way more retrograde, 5, 6 years ago. But, even 20 years ago, it was a pretty retrograde thing for a school to kind of double down on its commitment to, the Western tradition. And this school did. And so when I saw that, I was like, well, I want to teach at that place. That's a place that is making an intentional choice to do something that is going against the winds. So yeah, no, it's a little bit of a unicorn, as I like to say.
And it's maintained its integrity over the past decade or so.
Yeah, and in part, my intention here is not to sort of brag, but it has maintained its integrity in large part to my efforts to, hold, and say stop and no more. And I had, of course, support with the head of school and all this sort of stuff. But, as you might imagine, 5 years ago, at our year zero, the pressures were pretty substantial. And fortunately, I had done the homework. I knew all this stuff really, really well. And so I was able to, articulate a vision as to what this thing is for, not just what it's against. And of course, it jives with, jibes or jives. I always get that wrong. Jibes. It harmonizes with the the mission of the school, right? The mission of the school is it's a Benedictine school, so it's a Catholic school, and so I was able to kind of articulate it in such ways like, no, this is what we're doing, and there were definitely forces that were arrayed against it continuing in its form. But no, it's been a real labor, and you can't just be. You can't just run a rear guard action. You have to sort of positively articulate a kind of generative vision for why we're doing it. And so, we've been fortunate.
That is essential, but it's not enough, especially when we're talking about the circulation of teachers. You have to be very specific with how you hire. One thing that I noticed at Evergreen,
Amen.
And that then took place across all of universities in the West, broadly, is that if you go back to, I guess, the 60s or whatever, there was a substantial leftist or left-leaning contingent within the universities, but then they hired people lefter than them and lefter than them and lefter than them. And then when I got to Evergreen was just this morass of hyper leftists that had never even been challenged. So they weren't even good, solid leftists because they had completely formed themselves into an echo chamber, and then they elected to make things explicitly leftist. So
well, and that's why
that's
they were so easily toppled by the crazy lady at Evergreen, Naima. Look, I mean, this is my origin story. I was an undergraduate in 1991, And if you recall, I know I'm older than you, but
By a
a hair.
stone's
Okay.
throw.
At any rate, that was really the first push. That was the first PC push.
Yeah.
Was like 1990, 1991, and Jesse Jackson was big on that train, and that was the Stanford University, hey hey ho ho, Western Civ has got to go, and all this sort of stuff. And they were pretty successful at those elite colleges, but they were trying to seed this revolution all to all the various state schools and all the various feeder schools, and they were basically rebuked. Then. And so there was this sort of interesting period of time, again, 90s to around 2000, where it all, and I think a lot of, again, not conservative people, but just kind of, well, classical liberals, right?
Mm.
They kidded themselves into thinking like, oh, see, like we have curbed the excesses of this kind of thing, and now we can kind of settle into a kind of nice gentrified version of liberal progressivism. And that was really the lie I think that they told themselves. And so
Mm.
therefore that's why I was so fascinated by the Evergreen story for a variety of reasons. But that stuff came back in a vengeance. And so I think what had happened is that those forces basically did a kind of pre-snap read in 1990, 1991. They saw where all the cracks were, where they're going to be. They knew that they had to have some more hiring wins, but when they decided to roll out, they really rolled out. And so when I was in graduate school in English in 1995, in the fall of 95 and into the spring of 96, I'm an MA student. I've got funding. Actually, I got funding for my PhD, and I had a front row seat to a hiring process, right? And it became very apparent to me, weeks into this, and so they would bring everybody together, and we would see all the, there'd be like a dog and pony show, this person from Yale and this person from Harvard, because they had finally had an opportunity to do a hiring after like a 3-year freeze, something like that. And I was, and I was a very eyes wide open guy. I was not a naive graduate student. And I just knew then and there, I'm going to take my master's degree. It'll be terminal. I'm going to walk away because there's just zero chance for me to make it through a job process, because I had decided even then that I was just not going to lie to get a job. Because in order to get a job, you had to click all the boxes. And so that's why it's just like the height of irony for me now that all this sort of stuff in the last couple of years, like, oh my gosh, they have like, you have to have these diversity statements and all that. I'm like, yeah, they've been doing this for a very, very long time. So
Yeah.
to take it back to my story here, I was the dean of faculty for 6 years. So one of the ways in which I fought back against those sorts of things is that I positively hired people who loved the tradition and wanted to be at a place that supported, teaching the great books, that kind of thing.
How do you find those people if all the colleges of education are explicitly forcing people to become woke?
Yeah, you don't. So you hire no one who has an ED degree. Zero.
Okay.
You can't do that.
Okay, first and foremost. Okay.
Yeah, like zero, like off the stack. It's gone, right? And then what you do is, you word your job, your job description in such a way that you make it very clear what you're looking for. And so that has a way of kind of filtering off a lot of the they thems, et cetera, right? And then you have people, so then you get the resumes. And then you just look at, okay, where did they go to school? Okay. Let's say that they went to Harvard. Okay, because that happens. I mean, I work at a prep school. It's not unusual for us to get, a guy who's a humanities major and he wants to be a teacher because he loves coaching and loves this whole boarding school thing, right? Well, then you just then you learn to read the fine print. What did he do over the summer? What did he write his thesis on? How does he word his cover letter? Because there are certain kind of like tells, right? There's a certain little terms of phrase that you learn to look for if they are open to the tradition, right? If they're Foucauldian or Marxian or feminist or eco or whatever, they can't help themselves. The way that they write, the way that they word their emails, right away. At least I did. I trained myself right away to know when I was dealing with, someone who would want to come here and decolonize the curriculum.
Yeah, yeah. What set you apart? What made you special? What made you immune, or as you put it, wide-eyed, non-naive?
Yeah. Yeah, well, so partly was that experience in 1991. I was an undergrad at a state school, and they had this huge sort of push, this whole PC push. And as a high
From
school
which
student
direction? Students
from the
or
left, that's a
faculty?
good
Or
question. It was a lot of it was the English department at the school in
yeah.
conjunction with all the usuals, right? And I was actually a very woke high school student. I was raised Catholic. I went to a Catholic school, and I had decided that all of that was BS, and that I was going to sort of devote myself to the social justice cause. And the particular lens for
Who were you going to save? Just the world or
yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I was very much
the
motivated.
whales?
I'm from the South, and so I was very much motivated by the ghosts of racism that were all around me,
Hmm.
black poverty, all that sort of stuff, right? And I was a big MLK fan. I was just that was sort of I was part of that kind of social justice wing of the kind of legacy Catholicism that I had adopted, and then you just sort of get rid of the church stuff and you say, okay, I'm just going to sort of focus on, so I had a kind of do-gooder streak in me, because look, when you grow up around the kind of inequality, your understanding of it is outpaced at first by your experience of it, right? So you can see real poverty. You can see real, just and all the ravages, all the kind of cultural ravages of that, and before you can have any kind of grasp as to what may cause such a thing. It's that kind of classic lead with your heart, and then your kind of mind kind of follows. And it's actually funny. I was just tweeting this today. I was on my walk with my dogs this morning, and for some reason, the autobiography of Malcolm X popped into my head, and I had read that as a 17-year-old. And again, at this time, I was like a big like Spike Lee. Let's fight the man. Let's get rid of the evils of white racism. And I read Malcolm X, the autobiography of Malcolm X. I think it's As Told to Alex Haley, I believe. The guy who wrote Roots, and that book totally floored me. It's a great read. Number one, if you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's really fantastic. But it was the first time that I had ever experienced a critique of liberalism. Again, these are my words now, not really my words then. But it was the first time that I had read a critique of liberalism from a different perspective. It was not a critique of liberalism from like Rush Limbaugh and those kinds of things. It was a critique of the kind of do-gooderism, Great Society LBJ type thing from purportedly the very people it was meant to help. And that really blew me open in a pretty big way. And then I read some Thomas Sowell, a friend of actually my brother, gave me a book called Civil Rights, Rhetoric or Reality. And that just sort of blew open the whole, the myth that I had adopted as to what was really going on. And so then that set me on a trajectory. I happened to also be reading Aristotle and Augustine's Confessions and Plato and Homer in a course that I was taking. And so that kind of reawakened me to sort of the great books. And then I transferred from that state school and went to an intensive liberal arts school that was basically a great book school. And that's kind of, so I got inoculated, by a sort of a deep dive into the tradition. And so that I graduated with a degree in lit, but I did a lot of political philosophy, a lot of philosophy, a lot of theology. And so when I went to graduate school, I knew, it wasn't like I'm like, oh gosh, you guys don't like Plato? Like, I knew what the political landscape was going to be like, but I had read the source material. And so even literally I took a class. I remember my first term, my first semester, it was called Gender, Narrative, and Property. And I took it on purpose, right? And, it's like, feminism, post-structuralism, and Marxism, right? And that's what this course was. And she was all in, like she was, all aboard that train, but she couldn't help but like me and a buddy of mine who had a similar background because we read generously. We were not, sort of rubber stamping whatever she said, and we could talk in a non-combative way about ideas. And that was certainly, again, not because I'm awesome, but just because of the formation that I was blessed with
Hmm.
through my schools. That was a breath of fresh air for she was kind of a quintessential, boomer PhD,
Yeah, second wave feminist,
Yes,
maybe
very much.
cusping into third wave. Yeah,
That's right. That's right.
yeah,
And so even though she would have agreed with zero of sort of my ultimate takes on things, she admired, the fact that I could read,
hmm,
and talk ideas with her. So,
yeah, yeah.
um,
So
but I
you
would
you
still never
were
get a job. I would still never have gotten a job. It didn't matter.
yeah.
Yeah.
So when you were inoculated, 17, 18,
Yeah.
did you particularly feel the effects on a social level when you started to disagree with your cohort, or was there not enough people around you that were heavily invested in fixing, saving the world?
Yeah, so two things. I had a group of friends there. Like I wound up going to a graduate school, and there was like maybe 5 or 6 of us that were, we would call now like based, I guess. So it was a community. There were several people who were older than us, and there was a diversity there to where they had kind of stepped on all the landmines, and so they could kind of teach you, and they kind of
Yeah.
gave you a sort of way, how do you behave in these kind of situations. So that was very helpful. But wait, what was the second part of the question?
Well,
Forgot.
did it affect
Oh,
your social standing? Because
yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah,
yeah,
but
your thought
again,
on
like
that.
we were not assholes. We were winsome before that was a word. Because none of us were under the delusion that we weren't in enemy territory.
Hmm. Yeah.
And again, I don't say this to brag, but they were generally such midwits. Like, man, and I don't mean that in like an IQ way, right? But they were so narrowly formed, right? They had so little breadth and depth of appreciation of the story, that they just knew nothing, and so
Hmm.
it was unintimidating that way. And then so for me, it was great. I went from this very small, kind of conservative-ish, great book school where everybody was basically on board, and we had great, I was a great formation there. And so then when I go to this kind of larger, the real world, it's like, oh, well, I can handle this. There's nothing to be scared of here.
Yeah.
Um, you
Were
know,
you disappointed at all because you weren't surrounded by people who were trying to achieve or iterate upon the greatness of that tradition and bring it up one step further, but rather deconstruct, bring it down, or change its direction?
Well, I guess I was more depressed by the endeavor, right? Because when you go to a graduate school, you want to think like, oh, like this is where it's really happening, like this is where it's at, right? And it was pretty depressing because by then almost all of the pre-boomer faculty had retired. There was a couple. Um, but there was that weird divide. You've got like when the boomers sort of took over all the various academic leadership positions, they oversaw the sort of the burrowing out of the tenure track positions. And so there was this fascinating, you had the sort of the aristocratic tenure track folks, the assistant and full professorship. And then you had this entire cadre of worker bee grunts who had MAs or PhDs, but they were just adjunct professors. And so it's this fascinating class divide that nobody talked about, right? Because, we're all Democrats here. And, you know, while the sort of the highfalutin crew were sort of teaching their 3 graduate students, the grunts were teaching all of the undergrads, and they were just really bougie, like in the worst way. I remember going to, we had to take a teacher training course because I was a fellow, and the and it was funny. It was both a class divide and it was largely a sex divide. And so all of the people who ran the writing programs, which were all the adjuncts, they were almost all women, and they were all really low key, pretty bitter and angry about the full professor types who only had to teach like one or two a term. Like they had like the light loads, the old classic, right? And I remember one day we're there and we're all PhD students and we're, going through our teacher practicum. And so at the end, we had these like bag lunch sessions where we could like talk with other teachers about what they did for term papers and all this kind of stuff, right? And they get up there and they trash like, why do we have to have the kids write another term paper on the Fairy Queen? Like, why would we have to, sit through another, term paper on Paradise Law, whatever, like fill in the blank of, big work, right?
Yeah.
It's like, so what I did last year, is like last term is that, I needed a new washing machine. And so what I had my kids do is that I had them do research on washing machines so that I could teach them, how to do research and how to lay out pros. I mean, and so we were sitting through this and even like, like a couple of my lefty friends, they're sitting here like, are you for real right now? Like this is what we're doing, and even they could tell like, man, if this is what an English department is going to become, English is over.
Yeah.
And sure enough, it is.
Well, what just came out recently, there was I don't know where the article was from, but it said that the New Yorker, which is this preeminent place for fiction and has been hasn't published a white male who was born after 1984. And there's a systematic, intentional denial of specifically white men from book contracts, from publishing jobs, from publishing and getting their work in front of a readership.
Yeah.
Which I think, that's the death of that entire prestige institution. They just didn't know it yet.
Right.
All that energy, all that creative energy that white men had went to video games, went to board games, went to movies, went to the internet, went to 4chan, went to Reddit, went to Twitter, now is in Substack and is going independent. And I don't think that it's necessarily a bad thing that men, white men specifically, were denied the institutions, the prestige institutions that their forefathers had built. Because I think that white men are particularly suited to be in the wild, to be on the frontier, and so I think it's not necessarily a victimizing of the white man, because we should be able to innovate, and actually our job is to innovate, but we need to assess that the institutions themselves have become particularly against the white man. Why is that? What does that spell about the institution? And do you think that the institutions need to be burnt to the ground, or alternative institutions, Benedict option kind of things? I don't know. I'm throwing a lot of stuff out there.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. So, look, I think all great achievements in art have come through the playing of a long game. So if you think of somebody like, like a Faulkner or a Hemingway, right? Faulkner and Hemingway come at the end of a very long line, having been cultivated arguably from, sort of the time of Shakespeare, all the way on through. So where you have this very, and really like if you think of the Victorian and late Victorian novels, like that cultivates a kind of audience and an audience's expectations, so that once you get to something like Faulkner, you're like, oh, he's doing this thing which is in dialogue with Henry James, is in dialogue with Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville. Like it's in dialogue with all of these things, George Eliot and Jane Austen and Don Quixote, right? It's in dialogue with these things. And so my frustrations are not that like white men got shut out of the institutions, right? That's not really my beef with it. My beef is that excellence was not the North Star, right? That the cultivation of an audience that could continue to appreciate these kinds of things, that is what was sacrificed, not white men. I mean, I don't really care about like white men as a kind of this sort of large loose, baggy monster, but rather this notion of excellence. And so if you think of the same, think of like symphony music, or classical music, think of jazz music. I mean, I marvel. I mean, think about this, Ben. It's like there was a time, right? In the 40s and in the 50s and into the very early 60s, in which you had developed a sophisticated musical audience that would buy jazz records. And, I don't know how much of a dive you do into the whole music thing. I'm not a musician. I am a consummate appreciator, and I like all different kinds of genres, but that was really my obsession when I was in high school. It is shocking to me that we had developed an entire system that cultivated and selected and pressured and formed, John Coltrane, Miles Davis. Like where
and
is
their
that?
listeners and
That's right.
audience.
Yeah, right. That's what. Yeah, sorry. That's exactly right. Right. That yes. So are there the Miles Davises and the John Coltranes and the Faulkners and the Hemingways latently? Yes, I actually do think they're probably latently out there. The problem is that the selection mechanisms, which forged excellence, have been zombied, right? Have been, it's like, I imagine those like, those weird parasites that's like attack an animal and like burrow it out from the inside and then kind of like use it as a kind of mech warrior, right? I mean, that's what we're seeing, right? That it's not that the current literary scene is just like has different tastes. It's just shit. Right. It just is. Right. And my further sort of take on that is that it is not crap because I'm just a white guy who can't appreciate it. And it's not crap because, well, that's just what the market has dictated, right? This sort of the marketplace of ideas thing, which I don't fully buy. It's a, I don't really think there's such a thing really as a free market. I think that these are always formed and shaped by often cryptic forces that we're not fully aware of, right? And, if you look at all of the various industries that have been in our lifetimes run into the ground, it is because they lost sight of excellence as their North Star. So you think right now, this weekend, sorry to date the podcast, but, Snow White 2.0 live action came out this weekend, right? And a lot of people are going to say, go woke and go broke, and like, fine, that okay. But that this is downstream from turning this industry into a cash cow at its own expense, right? It's like the industry did not learn how to regenerate itself. It only learned how to cannibalize itself. And I think now we're just kind of seeing these last grass drops of it kind of just, it's a farce at this point.
Yeah. That is... So there are people... There's a guy named Lomez online. I can't remember.
Love Lomez. I don't know his real name, but I've always known him as Lomez. I love that guy. Yeah,
but he's got a real name, and he was thoroughly doxxed by some Antifa troglodyte. It was hilarious.
And it really backfired because
the ugliest guy. And Lomez is like,
he's this like shockingly handsome guy. Yeah. It's so perfect. I loved it when it came out. I was like, what a Chad, what a king. Love it.
And he's working with Passage Press. It is, and they're doing very excellent work. Pursuing excellence, like material excellence. It's really expensive to buy their books, but they're really beautiful. And they're going back and resurrecting older books like the Hardy Boys. They're doing a whole series where they're just going back to the pre-wokeified, pre-edited Hardy Boys and stuff like that. Because of copyright, they're allowed to do that and stuff like that. But it's really interesting that you bring up there's two sides of the equation. We could have really excellent artists, but without an audience that's attuned to what excellence is, it's not going to really go that far. When I was at Evergreen, it was kind of shocking to me. There was a lot of different things that were shocking, but before the whole like wokeification of it and that whole outburst, which is just fantastic.
Spasm, really. It's a paroxysm.
I was in a literature course and we were talking about, I didn't know what was going on because I was just taking the literature to learn literature, to produce literature. And I was there for my own purposes, but the teacher had done something about post-colonialism or the end of colonialist literature. And it was British literature in probably 1800s. And we were working around with the development of the novel. And I was trying to figure out from my own project, like the different transits that literature had taken in its form so that I could model that in the kind of postmodern way that I wanted to do, which is to take story through its development and then have it talk to itself through all of those different forms. And I was assigned, or I chose to to critique this little narrative where this guy goes on a journey, because it's colonial era. He goes on this journey. He gets stranded with 4 women, and it's this kind of Garden of Eden thing. And it's kind of divided into their different races. He ends up having 4 wives, and one of the wives is black. And it turns out to be the case that the sons of he won't really fully merge and fully marry the black woman. He kind of keeps things on the outs with her. And then it turns out that the spawn through her caused chaos to happen. And he could read that as like black people are lower. But I went through there and I saw all the biblical references and I kind of charted it on Joseph and his 4 wives and how you have different relationships that are being modeled here. And it's not really a racist thing, but none of my classmates at all knew anything about the Bible at all. Like they had no clue. Like, what are you talking about? I'm like, have you ever, and they're like, and then I'm like, so you can't understand anything in anything that we're talking about because you don't know what they're reading. And you're looking at it from the outside, let alone even understand what belief is, what sincere, authentic belief is. You're already on the outside. And so everything is so their postmodernism for them is a way of trying to make meaning out of all these disparate meanings because they have no thread of sincerity that runs through this whole authentic tradition. Whereas postmodernism for me is that there is a sincerity and there's playfulness in having the tradition dialogue with itself and playing around with those things, so playing around with itself and being on the understanding that there's an outside and an inside, but postmodernism divorced from the spirit, let's just say, has nowhere to go and just leaches itself out.
Yeah, because it renders it robs people of a pool and and gives them a splash pool instead, right? In 1995 there used to be this trade magazine called Lingua Franca, and it was kind of like it was sort of like Time magazine for academia. It's so wild to think that they had all these magazines back in the day, pre-internet, of course. And there was an interview with this guy by the name of Frank Lantricchia. And Frank Lantricchia was among the first of the boomer academics to take a sword and go after the new critics. And the new critics were, of course, the pre-war and post-war professors that created the idea of a close reading and a deep reading of the poem as such, poems qua poems, novels qua novels, etc. And he railed against that as a kind of crypto Christianity WASP thing, right? So he was and he was very successful, very famous, and he was sort of like early adopter of the critical theory, right? But interestingly enough, but he made a turn professionally. He became a novelist and a fairly successful novelist. And they're interviewing him in this Lingua Franca magazine, and he's like, I finally got fed up with teaching because my students they hadn't even read Moby Dick. And I'm like pulling my hair out. They don't read Moby Dick because of you. You're the one who destroyed even the very notion of a curriculum as being a kind of form of white nationalism or patriarchy or what have you, right? You gutted the curriculum, and now you're frustrated because your students don't know the references. Well, and so to your story and to Evergreen, they've won, right? They've won in terms of decolonizing the curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
And, there are always a couple of like homeschool kids who like know the references, who know the Bible at least, and maybe they've read some summaries of Shakespeare or maybe even a whole Shakespeare play. Maybe they've read like, versions of the Iliad and the Odyssey. But by and large, kids don't read anything. They have no metaphors that reach any deeper than the last 3 or 4 years of movies,
Yeah. Movies,
Friends, and The Office.
Yeah, well, and Lord of the Rings, maybe, if you're in a right-wing crowd.
if you're in a right-wing crowd.
And
right?
just the movies.
Right. But now, so like in my world, I teach this great books thing, right? And so when we get to let's say Paradise Lost, Milton knew his Bible pretty well. He's pretty, he's pretty sharp there. And I have to do like Bible day.
Yeah.
Now, they take a scripture class here and this, but it's like, no, really, guys, like these are the stories. Like it's bent. I mean, it's like it's hardly anything, but you really have to tell them, like this is the story. And I have found that I have not encountered so much hostility as I've encountered indifference and apathy, right? And it's not even motivated. It's not like, it's not angry. It's just kind of whatever. And
how does this matter to me?
Right. Now, what's so exciting, I have to say, to sort of, put a little bit more of a positive spin on this is that, every year. So I've been teaching Paradise Lost for. I just finished my 18th go through here.
Nice.
Yeah. And it's such a hard book, but it's so good. It's like, I think books 9 and 10 are like the most psychologically insightful and amazing thing you could ever read. And every year, I expect some of my really smart kids to like it. And sure enough, it sings to you in a certain kind of register if you're sharp, right? But every year there's always like a handful of like, my guys and gals who are a little bit, further down the distribution, but they love it. Like it works. It works. Now, I'm not saying, look, here, kid, take Paradise Lost and come back and talk to me in a month, right? That's not going to do it. I mean, we every day we're working together and we're reading small little chunks and we're working our way through. But it still resonates. It still works, which gives me, of course, great hope that those threads, we do go through, dark ages. We do go through periods of barbarism that from which we can recover. But it requires people, right? It requires, like people like me, sort of continuity figures, right? Who kind of keep this thing going. And so that's kind of what I've been chewing on a lot lately because they, I'll stop there. But these stories that rely, as you say, so heavily on all of that stuff that comes before it can still work. They can still resonate. They can still, vibrate with salience for a kid who doesn't ever read a book outside of class.
Yeah. I've been despairing of late. My story was that I was at Evergreen, they blew up, I went online to tell the story, I got connected, and then I used this app called Twitter that's now called X. I don't know if it's an app, it's a website, whatever.
Okay.
And it was very powerful tool, X/Twitter, at connecting me to people, at investigating different topics and different discussions, and kind of following different threads on the reaction to this homogenous, progressive, just deconstruction of all of reality at the in order to achieve some sort of post-human, post-historical man. Like there's this, they're trying to create a human being or a soup in which a particular human being can be created, but the human being that they create is riddled with neuroses and anxieties and hatreds and resentments and ultimately, without the structure of power, is the most pathetic, powerless creature that you could imagine, because it's completely reliant on deconstruction and all this stuff. But I've been, ever since Trump got kind of won, and he did this comeback, and that Kamala Harris and the Joe Biden regime and the entire edifice of the USG was kind of summarily handed a mandate to take a back seat. And the right was ascendant. And maybe it's just my psychology. It's like, well, they're no longer the dissidents. So they're inherently uninteresting to me, because they're no longer kind of the underdog, because there's something about me and the way that stories work for me. It's like, I want the person who is fighting against all odds, not because they're a victim, but because there's more traction and friction for them. So there's more on the line when things aren't going your way. Not necessarily that because you're weak, I want to exalt you in the kind of progressive way. But what happened to me, I'm trying to get to the point to say that there's just a lack of depth in the right wing. It kind of won, but there's a lack of depth. Like, there's somebody, I hope I bookmarked it. Somebody said there's a cycle of slop for the right wing to be really aware of. It's like current events, trad stuff. There's just a lot of slop. And now I'm seeing all this slop, and I'm like, well, where's the depth? Where's the conversations? Where's the real tension in development? And when I was investigating gender, I did a lot of interviews with feminists that I disagree with feminism in a lot of ways, and I'm a man, so I'm kind of at odds with it anyways, because the way that it's designed itself, and plus because it's ultimately a progressive project that just didn't go far enough, and they cannot admit that. But when I was investigating them and interviewing them, they were beset by this trans ideology that was just destroying their children and destroying their safe spaces and eating them alive, eating that movement alive. And so it was really interesting to see them embattled and see them trying to wrestle and see them actually saying, well, maybe biology does matter. Maybe men and women are different, and trying to make that thing. But I don't know where I'm going with that. I'm trying to, and I think that the direction is literature and going kind of back through why English went wrong, like specifically what it is, where critical theory branched off and kind of corrupted everything. Because without literature, without the story, without the mythos, there is nothing but slop. And so what's really interesting on the right, the most salient contention on the right is between the classical liberals now, the anti-wokies now realizing that they're in bed with people who have a completely different vision of reality than them, the dissident right, the Machiavellian right, which they're now trying to call the woke right. But I think that the classical liberals have a year zero that starts at the American founding. Maybe they don't have they're not tied to tradition.
Yeah, I actually think it's like 1995. I call it 1995ism.
Yeah, no, it is. Everybody wants to be back in 1995, and you're like, well, but there's no history there. Right. Like, you can't go back to the end of history because there's no history there.
That's right. Yeah. By the way, I love that book. It is.
Which book?
The End of History.
Yeah. Okay. Fukuyama.
And not because I like Fukuyama, but the book is really quite good. And the second half of that book, I think, is called The End of History and The Last Man. The Last Man is like, I consider that essential reading, because to me, that cuts right at the heart of this malaise, I think, that you're butting up against, right? That The End of History and The Last Man is a man without quest, right? It is, and a man without quest is a man stuck in a meaning crisis, right? Because in my way of thinking, like, quest and meaning are like the same.
Yeah.
And and in many respects, like, Bill Clinton really is sort of the ultimate last man, right?
So and again, build on that.
And I don't mean this like from a Democratic politics versus,
Yeah,
I don't
no.
mean it that way, but
But as an
you know,
archetype, as a
yeah,
figure.
right. Nothing is sort of, and to be frank, I mean, I wasn't a Clinton fan back in the day. I always thought it was kind of funny. But there's something rather pathetic about a man scraping and clawing his way to the most powerful position ever, right? I mean, historically, ever. And what does he do with it? But he gets down and dirty with an intern in the Oval
With a
Office.
mid intern. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, right. It's like
Midterm.
that's what you did with that. Like,
Yeah.
so why does someone who tries to fashion himself in the mythos of the new JFK, right? Again, put aside all the real stuff for a second. Just think about that as a myth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what it takes is sort of the man from hope and all that sort of stuff. And this is what it comes down to: is getting blowjobs in the Oval Office by a midterm, and then like cringe of cringe, buying a copy of Leaves of Grass. Like, oh, it's like, whew, that's a really depressing thing. And instead of getting all like, up in arms about it from a moral standpoint, which is fine. I think it's morally ghastly and all that nice stuff. It's true because it is. But it's like even more so to me was that this is pointing to a sort of a coreless meaninglessness at the end of history, right? And we don't know how to deal with that, I think. And in part, it's because Bill Clinton didn't Bill Clinton was not informed by a mythos of heroism. He was informed by a mythos of like image. And heroism is inherently self-sacrificial. Whereas, playing the role, right, the image, being, the star, doesn't. And so there's a sort of a hollowness at the core of that whole thing that, and I think Bill Clinton is sort of a quintessential, late 20th century icon. And so what strikes me, what's going on now, in this fight, like you said, between the sort of the dissident right and the left me's, as you like to say, and the classical liberals, and they're going after the woke right, and today's apparently Liberty Day on X right now, and it's I my sense is that you have a bunch of people who still have not come to terms with the ideology of liberalism as such, right? And so what I really like about the dissident right is that they see through the ideology of liberalism in a sober way. And it doesn't even have to be in like a flame-throwing kind of way, but they just recognize that you are smuggling in an entire ideology and worldview under the banner of no philosophy, no ideology, right? It's sort of in the name of a process, it smuggles a philosophy, right? In the name of a sort of a proceduralist view of things, like you do you, and love wins, and all that kind of nice stuff that we all loved in the mid '90s, right? What you don't realize is that that's not free, right? That's not a free thing, and my sense of the liberals, the classical liberals, these really holding on, is that they still have like a daddy issue with God, in a profound way, and I know that makes me sound like a little bit of an asshole, and I don't want it to come across that way. I'm not a sort of fundamentally combative person, but as someone who went through my own process with that, that you just don't want to sort of own up to. Well, I mean, it's something like Peterson would say, right? That life is about self-sacrifice and shouldering the responsibility of your own being and all that kind of stuff, that he said, that resonated with a person like me, because finally somebody else who's not a conservative Catholic is saying these kinds of things that I think are absolutely essential to living a meaningful life. And all of us have been brought up in a world that basically just decided to be mute on questions of meaning, right? It's private. It's like, well, is it? I mean, really, is it private? So it's such a confused worldview, because even like this discussion, liberty right now that James is waging, it's like, well, it's the same question as to, if you're a conservative or you're a progressive, like conserving what? Progressing to what? Freedom for what? Right? And you actually have to answer that question.
You have to answer that question.
And it's right, and it's not and I think it's not a question you can just answer like in time, right? Like, it's like a mission statement for a company. Like within 5 years, we'd like to expand our reach to X, Y, and Z, and we can like measure that somehow. And like, see, that's meaning. Like, maybe so for a company, but like for a person, even let's just say, that your goal in life, your sworn goal in life is to vanquish communism once and for all. For what? It's like Tom Brady. It's like Tom Brady. I live in New England, and I'm not from here, so it was like very interesting to sort of watch the Patriots be the Patriots for 20 years or whatever it was, right? And it's like, he wins a championship, and then the next year, like he's like, you're going to do it all again, and it's like, well, then what? And then what? And then what? Like, well, you're going to run out of hands, right? And your body's ultimately going to kind of give out on you, and then what? Right? And again, I don't mean this as an attack on Tom Brady. I really enjoy watching someone pursue excellence. Like, it's really, no shade, like no irony. Like, it's really impressive to watch, right? Any man chasing craft and perfection through a craft, to me, it's like, God bless you. Like, we need those kinds of things, but it's always the then what question, and I don't think it's a question that you can keep kicking down you can't keep kicking that can down the street. Like, you actually have to face it.
Well, that explains the psychology. Sorry, James, if you ever tuned into this, but James Lindsay has this.
No, y'all
pattern.
are friends, and y'all are friends, okay, and I don't. I do know that. Believe me, I used to watch you guys all the time, right? So,
yeah,
and
I haven't
James
had
for me,
in a while, and I don't know if I can.
But for him personally, like, he was like a voice of like crying out in the wilderness when I was fighting my own woke battles. It was very helpful. So full disclosure.
Yeah. He's done tremendous work. As soon as the woke started to break politically, he went directly to attacking the right. Because I think there's meaning for him in attacking authority structures. Like, he will go after this, and he does this perpetually, and I watch it and I tune in, and then I have to mute him because I'm like, why are you doing this to another group? You're going to go after another group.
Right.
Now he's belaboring Christians. He's like, you can't believe in Christ if you have to put liberty above Christ. And then now you're a bunch of authoritarians. Like, well, what are you even talking about? But it's because there's no liberty for what? We're going to defeat communism. Okay, now what? Yep. Well, we have to defeat fascism. Okay, well, now what? Well, now we have to defeat this other thing, because there's nothing there other than liberty. And that is in and of itself the wokest you can be. It's the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is the original wokeness. What did the Enlightenment do? And we have to get into this. Is really uncomfortable, because you have to ask these questions. You have to start taking these pills. And it's rather woke. You have to wake up to the woke spell of the Enlightenment, and then you have to say, well, for what? And I think that you put it in story terms. It's really good to think about it in having daddy issues. The West had daddy issues. I don't know when, and I don't know why. You could probably even trace it back to Jesus saying, "I am my Father are one."
I think so. I think you have to actually, and I do think Milton is helpful in this regard. But please keep going.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, I just want to establish the conditions for you to tell the story.
Right. Look. The ultimate daddy issues. Sorry. Finish this, and I'm going to go back
it's just
to this.
it's ultimately a question of authority. The classical liberal left me's they don't want anybody telling them what to do and what to believe in.
Yeah.
But they then can't tell anybody what to do or what to believe in either. They can only ever tear down any authority because they can't. They're so uncomfortable with authority. It's a daddy issue because they can't accept that ultimately that reason is not God, and that choice and consent are not God. They're very important parts. Reason, rationality, consent. They're very important parts of what it is to be a man, to be a human being. But if they're God, then that means that you can't have anybody smarter than you. You can't have anybody consent to anything, and therefore you can't tell your children what to do, and therefore you're going to end up transing your children because you have to do what they say for them. Anyways, yada yada yada.
Yeah. So look, this daddy issue thing goes all the way back to the sort of the great opening statement of Western Civ. Again, all these sort of loose and fictional constructions, but you follow me. It's like there's no greater epic of someone dealing with daddy issues than the Iliad, right? The whole point of the Iliad is that Achilles has been prophesied to kill Zeus, right? And so what happens is there's this bait and switch that occurs that Thetis is convinced by Zeus to mate with a human so that this, divine son won't kill Zeus. He'll become the greatest hero on earth, right? And so to understand the rage of Achilles, right, which is what the whole thing starts off with, the rage of Achilles is that his beef is ultimately with Zeus himself. And he kind of knows it. He kind of doesn't fully know that he knows about these prophecies. It's all kind of vague, right? And so what you have in that story is that he's this great figure that is slighted by Zeus and then slighted by Agamemnon, right? And so he's like, well, I'm just going to sort of take my ball and sit on the sidelines, and we'll see how you like this, when you slight me. And of course and he has to kind of, because his best friend he's dressed like him, he looks like him, he's like his totem, he gets killed, then he goes back in and he just like mauls everybody down, right? But it's interesting to me, right? Because you've got then the foil on the Trojan side, you've got Hector, right? And Hector is, of course, the great dutiful son, right? And so he destroys.
Loves his father. Loves his brother.
Right. Devoted, right. He is destroyed by Achilles, mutilated and desecrated by Achilles. And finally, Achilles at the end of that epic is spent, right? And what does Homer do? It's so brilliant, right? He has Priam, the dad. He comes secretly to Achilles' camp and he comes in full humility. Can I have my son back? And it's at that moment where his rage is just, it's done. And it's just this beautiful moment at the end of this, where the son buries the hatchet with a substitute father, right? And that's what we've got, right? It's substitutional, right? And we can play all games later on. We can do this, the theological games with it later on. But you can see that there's this paradigm and image sort of right there at the end, like dealing with the fact of fatherhood, right? And the fact of being a son, and the kind of rage, right, of the ways in which dad has screwed you over and messed it up, or and all those things that all of us have to deal with, right? It's all there latent, kind of in this sort of this originary expression, and I love Homer so much, and he instructs us so much. So anyway, sort of going back here to sort of our times, right? You can't defer the daddy issue thing, right? And in my experience, those guys, especially guys, but women too, they've got it in their own sort of way. And guys have to deal with their moms, and gals have to deal with their fathers, and, fine, okay. That, the sooner you can come to terms with your daddy issues, the more productive and generative you can become sooner. Something like that. More health. I hate the word healthy, but it's like the more healthy you are,
The more able you will be to avoid your own foolishness.
yeah. Right. But I mean, look, there's an entire way of reading the tradition through the sort of the various ways in which we either mess up or don't mess up the dealing with father issues. And so, it's no surprise that, the other great expression of, sort of the Greek, genius is Oedipus, right? And it's like, Oedipus and his own father, and so these patterns kind of keep repeating themselves. And so what the classical liberals seem to wish to do is to play a daddy's murder game without calling it a daddy murder game. Right. Because liberalism is sort of saying like, look, enough of these like God fights, like enough of these religion fights. Like, it's like, I'm going to kind of rise above it all. And I'm going to sort of tell you how it really is.
Yeah.
And like, well, you're not playing fair, actually, right? You're because you're playing the role of the son who is above it all, even above the father, right?
Yeah.
If we can think of legacies, right? That the legacies, and look, and I don't.
The only way to do that is to convalesce your own father.
Yes.
Is to kill God, basically, and put him on life support.
Correct. Right. Hospice, yeah, great, let's do it.
Yeah.
Right. And the problem is that, well, what's the problem with that? The problem with it is that it's not, you haven't come to terms with it. Right. Well, the problem for the classical liberals is that they have kids too.
Mm-hmm.
And what then? It's like the problem with the boomers. Like in certain respects, I don't blame the boomers for reacting to the silent generation, the war generation. Like I'm sure, I read, the great biography of Jim Morrison, and it's like part of me is like, I don't blame him, for reacting to his admiral father, and who didn't have a relationship with his son, like so but eventually, you pass 30, right? And so then you become, the dad, and so then what are you going to do with that role, right? And so there's been a kind of boyification of everything, and I don't know about you, Ben, but when I see the sort of the classic liberals kind of get into it, it just seems really immature.
Oh, well, I'm not convinced by it, but I do want to. I want to hone in on the issues that they're bringing up. Like, do we want mandated authority? I mean, they're reacting to the threat of authority, of collective action on any any level, but we have to have a collective action. We have to have a tradition. We have to have a myth, and they inherently believe in a. You can see where they believe in a myth when you attack certain, like the whole Churchill martyr made Constantine thing. It's like, okay, oh no. No, Israel for some reason stands in for God. I think for them, like Israel as the city on the hill where it's all elective. Like it's an ethno state, but it's not really an ethno state. It's like the modern state. It gets to have its own borders. It gets to have its own self determination as long as it's funded heavily. There's something about Israel that I think is that's where the daddy complex gets to sneak in.
Well, it's a placeholder, isn't it? It's so interesting that you bring that up. I think you're exactly right about this. I hadn't quite thought about that, but it's the only country that's allowed to act like all the reactionaries think a country should act.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. To care about its own ethos, to care about its own natus, to care about its own borders, to have self-determination. God, that's so funny. That's exactly right. That's exactly
what I hadn't thought
immigration. About that. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. For some reason, yeah, but there is so that's why the dissident right, which isn't dissident right now, we'll see what's going to go on. They bring up great critiques of liberalism by just accepting that power is.
Right.
Somebody has to control things, and it's better for them to be explicit about what they expect from the population than implicit and coercive. And this is the weird thing with Wokal. Great guy, love the guy,
Yeah,
have him
me
on.
too.
But like, it takes forever for him to admit that liberalism can't actually dictate morality, and he does want to live in a moral society, and he'd rather have a Christian liberalism than an Islamic liberalism, right? But how can he do that? He can't push that on anybody. We can't push that on anybody. So, and I don't want that pushed on me either. But I know that with that, and I'm still stuck in that I was going to bring up Jim Morrison much earlier on, because that movie that Oliver Stone made, I can't remember what it was called. It was a great film. With
No One Here Gets Out
Ryan
Alive. No, that's the name of the book. It's called.
It's just The Doors.
It might be The Doors, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. But that movie, I watched it when I was 19, and I fell in love with myself as this guy who could just drink and dally and have affairs and be creative. And then I came back and I watched it 20 years later. And he was such a pathetic, his art was so pathetic because it wasn't concentrated. After he released the energy from tradition, like he just wilted incredibly quick.
Yeah. I was similarly inspired by him. That was, I read the book. I don't know why. It's so funny. These books that kind of find their way to me.
Lodged into you.
Yeah, but I read it. I read that it's. I believe it's written by his bandmate. Yeah, The Doors of Perception, or No One Here Gets Out Alive. Doors of Perception is the Huxley book that he named the band after. But and it's a fascinating biography. But it. Well, look, one hopes that as an artist, you can live at least to like 50, right? Because you have some time to kind of mature your vision, hopefully, right? And then one hopes that you can get that cool second career that a lot of people have post 50, Yeah, I always think, I'm a big C.S. Lewis fan, and it always bums me out that he died at he was I think 63 years old when he died, or 62 years old. And God, what would have a Lewis in his 80s thought? A Lewis who could have watched the sexual revolution unfold. That would have been amazing. Anyway, the Jim Morrison thing, it's kind of cringe, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's kind of cringe.
It's Gen X cringe. It's not Boomer cringe. It's Gen X cringe.
Oh, that's
based on Boomer. Based on Boomer.
Yeah.
I mean, that was our. We talk about. I can't say that we're very much of our age. We're very much of our time, and there's no way that we can disown our liberalism any more than the liberals can disown their Western Christianity. It's just there. Liberalism is the father issue that I have, and a lot of the dissident right energy is attacking liberalism as though as the representative of the father that set you up with all these wild promises, wrote all these checks for you, and none of them, it all came to naught. It's like a very wasteful. Your father was Ponzi, hedge fund manager, and now it's like, well, but where's the meaning? And then you have to go back to your grandfather and stuff like that. So the threading the needle, I was listening to an Ezra Klein podcast for the New York Times, and it's fascinating because he has no idea why Trump won, and he's trying to make it about race, and the guy that he's talking to is like, it's not about race, and the only people basically that are left for the Democrats for their power is college educated women, boomers, and basically kind of like the remnants of the Black Power movement in their current iteration.
I think they're going to ditch them. I think the Black Power folks are going to ditch the Dems. I mean, they might just out of, well, who else are they going to? They're not going to vote for JD Vance, but they might just not vote, right? Which in our age is, that's a big difference maker, right? I think, so Ezra Klein, as a, I've been a conservative basically since I was 20, right? I was super woke in high school, and
You get soul
that.
pilled.
Yeah, I did. I did. It was two things. I read Sowell's Civil Rights Rhetoric and Reality, and then a couple of his other books, like what is it, the one with the constrained and the unconstrained vision, the conflict of
Yeah.
visions is
Conflict visions.
really a fantastic book. But I also read C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man when I was 19, and I didn't understand more than maybe 20% of it. But I knew that I wanted to be the kind of person who could understand what that book was laying out. Right. And so that was kind of like fuel for me. Like I wanted to be able to figure that stuff out. So anyway, I've been conservative for a really long time. Or whatever you want to call this, traditional. I don't know. It's hard exactly to put my finger on it, um, but so when you are a fairly well-read conservative who comes of age in 1995ism, you always, like, I have had to kind of like guard my speech and sort of recognize that I had to be careful who I sort of came out to since I was 20 years old. I'm 52. Right. So I have been listening to liberals and progressives talk to themselves as if I don't exist for a very long time. Right. And I tend not to play the role of like spoiler at the party. Right. I'm not that guy. I'm a pretty affable person, and I like to hear what people have to say, and I don't like to be combative in real life. And I'm a teacher, and so I'm always cognizant of the fact that I don't want to turn my classroom into some sort of MMA octagon. I'm trying to to play the winsome card, right? But people like Klein, they just don't know what they don't know, and I'm fascinated that they continue to operate and be remunerated in such handsome fashion that still does not require them to understand
What they're
reality.
talking about.
Yeah, right. I mean, and like he's Ezra Klein, right? I mean, I have no idea. I'm sure he does very well for himself, right? By virtue of the platform that he is being promoted through and all that nice stuff, right? But I stumbled across. Do you know who Bill Simmons is?
No.
He's a famous sports guy. In fact, he was called like the Boston sports guy back in the early days of the internet, and created quite a following for himself on Page Two on ESPN. And then he became the kind of guy. He wrote for Jimmy Kimmel for a year or two, and then he was the one who spearheaded the ESPN's 30 for 30, that kind of sports document series. It was very successful. Anyway, he runs one of the most downloaded podcasts. It's sort of sports and culture related, and he's done a bunch of things. Really talented guy. And one of his kind of go-to guys is this writer by the name of Chuck Klosterman. And Chuck Klosterman writes kind of like ironic, sort of slacker generation takes on kind of pop history, and he's a smart guy, and I like listening to him. And but I can agree with like nothing. It's like, it's not like I don't go to listen to that to sort of affirm my priors. I just sort of, what are people talking about? Anyway, Thanksgiving week after Trump's victory in November 3rd or what, right? So 2.5 weeks or so later, he goes on a podcast with Bill Simmons, and he is beside himself, right? Because he's so surprised, like he doesn't know what the heck is going on. Now, remember, these are two guys who are paid to know what's going on.
Yeah.
Right. And he has this extraordinary line where he says, Bill, it seems to me that if you read the news and you followed the stories, you were totally surprised. And then if you didn't, you really weren't that surprised that Trump won. And I'm like, you're watching this. I'm like, yeah, yes, like that. Pay attention to that. Why do you think that is?
Yeah.
And I don't know why they cannot possibly conceive of like being codified by listening to sources that are beyond the pale. It's like what's that disgust factor? Is that what Haidt talks about? It's like they have this just disgust factor with, non, mainstream, oh, well, everybody kind of knows what's going on. Oh, come on, we know things, right? It's that kind of weird dynamic.
Yeah.
And I am, and these are guys are paid to know, and they can't do it. So, I mean, so what is striking to you about the Ezra Klein thing? I mean, like, he's doing this big pitch right now on abundance or whatever it is. I mean,
Yeah. Well,
what, how does that play?
Well, I'm constantly aware of my own shortcomings as an interviewer because I have to go on these long processing things because I have an idea, but I have to follow it down the rabbit hole and go like that. But it was basically the young men question.
Yeah.
We see a huge split between young women and young men, and young women are going red, blue, or whatever, and young men are going. And that worries the classical liberals because the classical liberals, they're just fucking like they're just watered down wokies. It's like everything's either fascism or communism. It's like, oh no, you're the young men are being radicalized. They're being radicalized. Well, so why? And if you, I see it and it's cringe. They try to talk to the young men, but they don't respect the young men because they don't respect. It's like if you don't resolve your daddy issue, you can't be a father. You can't. Nobody's going to respect you.
That's right.
And you're gonna be unable to not dive into your own foolishness over and over and over again. So the question is, how do we speak to the young men? And there was a tweet that was talking about Andrew Tate being actually no young men actually like young Andrew Tate. He's propped up by people who are afraid of young men listening to Andrew Tate. Now, I don't know if young men actually like Andrew Tate, but he's so shallow and so like dead-ended. Like he's the evolutionary. If you fall for Andrew Tate, he's basically a dodo bird for your psyche. It's just you're gonna end up spending your resources on something that's not going to be your kind. But there is an opportunity, a vast, tremendous opportunity, because young men are seeking. Jordan Peterson did something where he opened the door. I don't think Jordan Peterson's necessarily going to lead you down any further than, like, you should say there is a library. I think that's basically, there's a library and there's a way to read the library. But anything beyond that foyer, you're going to have to go. So there needs to be librarians, there needs to be teachers, and there needs to be a story or hinted at. Like, there is a story here. And when you were talking about the Iliad, like your passion just ignited my passion, and I started getting teary. I was like, this is the stuff. This is the stuff. And I think that literature is super important. We talk about like these foundation myths and people talk about history and stuff, but like, what is the real foundation myth of the West? Where do we have to go? And young men have the potential to actually organize collectively and reform, not just conserve, but reform what they've been handed. And they have to be handed something. And it can't be just an image of a cathedral, because they're not going to build a cathedral. It can't be the image of Western trad wife, because they're not going to get that. They're not going to get that. But they're going to get something from the past that they're going to be able to inhabit in this moment of time. And I think it's through the transitions or the transmission of literature that they can understand.
Yeah. So hard agree. Of course, that is my passion, and that's what ignites me. I'm positively obsessed with this issue, and I have been for a decade because I teach high school kids, right? And so I'm currently teaching Gen Zs, right? But I basically taught millennials, and I watched them drink heavily from the draft of late liberalism. I always, how people always talk about late stage capitalism. I like to talk about late stage liberalism. Drank heavily from that trough, right? And if you look at sort of those tenets, right, is that, you don't need another person, you should garner experiences, not things. You should, not worry, with all those sort of things, right? Basically 95ism on steroids. And I watched them systematically flounder, I stay in touch with a lot of my former students, not a lot, but a handful, and they come back because I'm here. And so they come back, to visit from time to time. And, a lot of them have not coupled. A lot of them, whatever, have a lot of great experiences. I'm sure their Instagram feeds are great. But there's not really a lot there. And, and I watch my own students now currently, and they don't know how to act. They don't know how to behave because they've been, more than half of their life is filtered through this thing and, the smartphone. And it is not helpful, in terms of dealing with the real. And so I'm absolutely obsessed with this issue. So to the Tate thing, I'll get back to Homer and stories and lit in a second, but the Tate thing is a tremendous opportunity, I think, not to baptize Tate. I mean, Tate's an idiot. But he does one thing really, really well. And that is he refuses to lie to boys about the differences between men and women. Again, now I have no truck for his for him, but he at least says, you know what? Girls and boys are different, right? Now, that is a fairly pedestrian point, right, Ben? Like we know these things, but
do we though?
well, right. Well, no, I think this is a real thing, and I look at my own, sort of formation, and I have to say that even though I went to a very conservative school and I sort of had drank deeply from the tradition, the book that really energized me in the 90s was Camille Paglia. And, Camille Paglia's just insistence that like biology's real, man. It's like men do things and women do things. And she even has that kind of line in Sexual Persona that like every great poem, every great, bridge, every great building, every great achievement that men have done, and she's always insistent that men have done these things, right, is the half-hearted attempt to replicate that which women can do through childbirth, right? And I just remember being like, man, like, I can't believe she just said that out loud. And can you imagine, is there anything more anathematized than that basic kind of notion?
Yeah.
And so Tate is a sort of this weird, condensed, clownish symbol of a man who just refuses to sort of pretend to the boys that, girls and boys are the same, right? I find it really sad that that's all it takes to get an audience, but I think that if I look at the young men that I know that, and again, they don't really take much seriously, so it's not like they're deep into the Andrew Tate discourse, right? But the things that they react to, are that kind of that macho thing that has been so anathematized in their entire schooling, right? They have been browbeaten since the time they were in kindergarten, and when they take their hand and they go like this and this and make a gun out of it on the pre-K recess field, and they get shamed by the women, who run the recess. They have known nothing but shame for these things that come so naturally to them, and I think that we are dealing with the cost of that. And this is why I get frustrated, because as soon as I bring up Tate, et cetera, on X, I immediately get the kind of like, how could you possibly, stay, he's a pimp and he, is, and I'm like, yes, I know all of those things. I know he's a dirtball. I know, but what I also know is that you feminists, those that call themselves feminists, and everybody else who's actually also a feminist, right? That's sort of this weird other lie that we live in, right? Everybody's a feminist, right? Everybody is. Maybe like 0.2% of the population is not. It's based upon a lie, right? And it's based upon a lie because, we are so safe. We are so without attacks on resources, without attacks, physically. Like we live in this weird bubble that we can pretend for now generations that men and women are different. That we can pretend that men and women are the same, right? And if you live in bullshit email world jobs, how much more so, do you see, like, well, I can do everything that Jim down the cubicle can do, or now Jim down the Zoom screen can do, right?
Yeah.
And so it's this weird, it's like this weird hothouse, in which you don't understand that right outside the panes of glass are like a frozen tundra, that wants to kill you. Right. And so, Tate, he drives fast cars. He's like buff and he works out and he's got a tattoo what is his famous question? What color is your Bugatti? Right. And that question like cuts right at the heart of like, he like tapped into that, like,
Okay.
almost preternaturally, right? Like that's such a guy thing. A fast car that is way more expensive than your house, and like he earned it, right? And again, all of that is BS, and we could say all those sort of things. But that question to me is why we talk about Andrew Tate, and so therefore, what is not being fed? If that clown of a sort of a proxy masculinity can resonate with boys, even if it's just on a quick TikTok scroll, how little are we feeding our boys this image of masculinity, right? And that any image of masculinity in any book that they ever read is either shamed. I mean, like, can you imagine what Odysseus, what kind of treatment Odysseus would get in a kind of random classroom today? I mean, he'd just get destroyed because he's not a feminist, right? He doesn't play nice with others and those kind of things, right? And so and so even positive images of masculinity, warts and all, right? I'm not here to worship Odysseus or anything like that. Get shat upon, and then that leaves you with contemporary lit, right? Which is, if you can find, I don't want to be too hyperbolic here, but if you can find a straight person, if you can find a straight guy, it's like he's well kept, and he's a kept man. And so the boys crave it. And if they're not going to get fed generative visions of this, they'll be fed degenerate ones.
Okay. Well, what's the generative version of that?
Well, I mean, generative
still maintains the power.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, something that I think was misunderstood, but I thought was a really good thing for Peterson to say is that, the real man is scary, right? There's a sort of a potential for scariness, there, but it's kept in check. It's like what you were talking about with George the other day. It's like this chivalric ideal is exactly what is lacking, and exactly, look, that built the world we live in. We're on the fumes of that world, but that's what built this world. That was a world that was men were called, vocare, they're called to protect the innocent, the vulnerable, and the weak, and to sacrifice for them. Right? That created, the West. In terms of where we have wound up here. And that vision, that chivalric vision, has been systematically ironized and castrated over the course of 150 years, maybe more, who knows? And that really took off in the latter half of the 20th century, after World War II, it seems to me. Even though there was,
JD Vance brought up interesting debate. I don't really understand the Latin or anything like that, but he brought up in conversation about like ordering your
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 loves.
care and
Yeah.
ordering your loves. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering from a literary point of view, how does Jesus Christ add to the Homeric tradition without diminishing the Homeric tradition?
Sure.
Because you do have chivalric society
Yeah.
after Christ and with Christ in the lead, but now since Reformation, Unitarianism, progressivism, it's all Christianity, but it uses Jesus as a way to
Shame.
and negate the male and the masculine and force.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why Christianity's been pretty piss poor, in the last 50, 60 years to deal with any of this, because they've given us a vision of a sort of a castrated Jesus, right? And and again, I want to be careful here. I'm not, I don't want to sort of turn Jesus into this sort of, I don't know, mega Chad, or it's way more complicated than that, right?
There were these cheesy T-shirts in the '90s where Jesus was like ripped or buffed, I did this for you or whatever.
Right. Right. So okay, so we probably have to get like to the whole kind of imitation of Jesus thing. I think that's a really hard thing, and it's pretty elusive, right? And so I think that's why we tend to gravitate toward proxies, right? And so in the Catholic tradition, you've got all these sort of different saints, right, that kind of do this, right? But we have many sort of visions or iterations, I should say, of saints who were like warriors first and then kind of gave it all up in order to sort of help spearhead and create a different way of being. Right.
Is this not the different way of being? Like the safe society?
Yeah. Yeah. No, because it's not a society. Right. I would say because what it misses, I think, is the notion of self-sacrifice. Right. And so, one of the things that was really unfortunate, one of the unfortunate unintended consequences, perhaps, of the Reformations was the notion of a kind of two-speed Christianity. And I think and I don't know if you've heard that expression before, but the idea that Luther and the Reformers, and certainly Calvin, sort of attacked this notion, this sort of older notion that there were like priests and nuns, and they kind of did Christianity kind of like for real, and then all the rest of us lay people kind of did a kind of a version of it. It's not quite as good, but and I, as a Catholic, I understand what Luther and Calvin are talking about with that. You can sort of
the tenure track and then the adjuncts.
Right. Yeah. Right. That's funny. Yeah. You could kind of see why that could easily become abused. Right. And it was. I mean, I think that my unpopular opinion amongst my fellow churchmen and women are that, I really understand. I feel like I really understand why Luther did what he did and why Calvin did what he did, right? I get it. Corruption is similarly disgusting to me, right? Which is, anyway. So, but like what the two-speed thing does get is that most of us are like called to, look, you and I are both husbands and fathers. It's like, you got to make the donuts. You got to get up, you got to do the thing. And, I don't have time to pour over the Psalms 5 times a day. I'm lucky if I can mix in start off my day with a prayer and end my day with a prayer, right? Life happens, right? But, so that medieval understanding is like, okay, like there's a recognition that the world of man has to sort of continue apace. Yes. But there's this other crew that are kind of there to, I don't know, pick up the slack, but sort of keep the church going, so to speak, and chanting and praying at all times, and all that kind of stuff. And so I'm kind of cool with that idea of a sort of a two-speed Christianity. And so I think a lot of our problems, our Jesus problems, stem from our unwillingness to just admit that there's such a thing as a hierarchy, and there's such a thing as an elite. And I know that, in Christ all things are equal, but these are tensions, right? And I think you have to kind of keep the idea of sort of egalitarian equality in a kind of tension with hierarchy all the time, right? And that's the cross, right? That's the transom of the cross that you're constantly trying to keep in tension and balance.
One of my favorite works of literature in world history is the Mahabharata. It's an Indian epic.
I don't know.
And there was this, it's fabulous. And there's this PBS version of it. No, or BBC or PBS did a version back in like the late 80s, and it's a multicultural cast, and
Love
it gets through in about 5 hours, this huge epic. And so it's Hindu, and one of the central stories is that there is this father who can't have babies because he made a deal or something happens, with the gods, and but his wives need to have children, so that they mate with gods, so then he has these 5 sons who are all one son, but 5 sons, and they end up marrying one woman, and they have to share her. But I think it's about the formation of an individual. Yeah. But from that is derived this, the caste system, and the caste system has a place for warriors, for priests, for the garbage, the dirty people, the politicians, the bureaucrats, and it articulates society, an ideal society. It says, we all have a different dimension that we cover, and the eternal question of a society, which is why I've been covering South Africa, is how do you articulate such a different, like, we're not all human beings. Like the progressive project at the end of history was South Africa. It's like, we're a rainbow coalition. We're all going to get together. We're going to have truth and reconciliation. We're going to tell the truth, and we're going to reconcile. That actually doesn't happen. You have power reconstituted, and now we're still in the situation where somebody has to either take all control and force peace and force harmony, or there has to be some sort of tentative process, this liberal process that allows these different societies to get along, to articulate difference. And America, we are continually at this. How do we allow all these different societies to get along? The elite said, well, we'll just do colorblind. We'll put them in a blender. And then we get woke, which is just like, now we're going to blend our children together because we can't deal with difference. The classical liberal is like, well, we have to have authority, but we're the only ones you can actually trust with authority, because we trust the process, and we trust liberty. We're not going to actually look at the difference. The dissident right the newfangled right has a problem with, now they notice difference all the time. It's like, well, the N-words over there, and the Israelis over there, and then they get caught up in the differences, and nobody is able to articulate, like, there's a place for all these different groups to come together and to respect each other. And that place in the Christian tradition is some version of Christianity. It's some articulation of Christ. And then the apostles, like true leadership, articulating all these different classes and all these different races and all these different ethnoses into some sort of not homogenous in a homogenized way, but in a homogeneous, like a common cause and a common pursuit that allows all these different distinctions. And the stories of the West have that in a way where we're just always at odds with the Father. We're always at odds with authority. It's like the Germans. They can't not go too far with, they go too far in the right direction. Now they're going too far in the left direction. I'm just wondering your thoughts on that. If Tate is a cartoonish version, what crumbs do you put in the way of the young men that allow them to notice things, but not to get hung up on the details or whatever?
It's a tough one. No, that's a great question. I think about this a lot. What vision am I trying to get them to see? I mean, look, I think we're failing the network problem, right? If you think of like Europe, they had this sort of unique opportunity to work out similarity and difference within the sort of confines of a distant father figure, called the Pope, right? Yeah. It's like the Pope is like there, kind of like says things from time to time, and the envoys pop back and forth, and but like really, it was always this sort of the threat of the hammer, right? I remember when I was a kid, and me and my brothers, we were whatever acting up or something, and all my mom had to do is like, "Do you want me to tell your father?"
Yeah.
You'd be like, "Oh no, I don't want to tell dad." And if we had really messed up, dad would come home, and it's like, oh, uh, and so we had that kind of weird latent
Yeah.
authority figure
Removed authority. Yeah.
that actually flexed pretty lightly if you look at sort of the historical record.
Yeah.
But fine. So we had some version of this, but now we don't, right? And I think you're right to hone in on that word authority, because the medievals were obsessed with the idea of authority and like from whence authority comes, and
Mm-hmm.
it's no surprise that what Luther ultimately rejects is the authority of Rome, right? Rather than Rome being a symbol of something, it was like, no, like I'm rebelling against like that guy, right? It's that weird way where a
Hmm.
king or a pope has two beings, right? There are two bodies, they would say. Like there's the body of the actual pope or king, but then there's also like the body. It's symbolic
Yeah.
importance, and we
Yeah.
we we
Yeah.
we we don't have that, anymore. And so now authority, but okay. So think about this question of authority. What was sort of the medieval vision of this? I think the medieval vision of this is chivalric, and I think it's Arthurian, right? That the accomplishment of King Arthur, right? The reason why he's such a salient and enduring image or symbol is that he had a way of taking power and sort of infusing it into a kind of tentative image of the round table, right? So that it lacks a head, at least in terms of its sense of as a deliberative body, right? So you take, so it's a move away from the kind of warrior chieftain model into
Hmm.
some form of authority that is informed not just my ability to kick your ass, right, or to put you in the stocks or to execute you if I have to, but an authority that is also informed and contained by a higher authority, of Christianity, right? And
Hmm.
that Christianity kind of functioned in that it's like this
Yeah.
software that hovers in the background that kind of keeps everything kind of in its sort of proper place and in check. And again, it's
Yeah.
imperfect and there's opportunities for corruption and all those sort of things. So,
Yeah.
but that's why I think people like Pajot and others sort of, go on about, symbol, and narrative structure. And
Yeah.
so one of the things that animates my own work is exposing kids to stories that provide them with sort of iterations of narrative truth,
Yeah.
that I do believe are constructive. It's not a quick fix,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
You
I'm
don't
sure.
go read, I don't know, Macbeth, and then like, your world suddenly makes sense to you.
No,
It's a little bit
no,
more.
no, and I think it's instructive in how you spoke about how you read through Paradise Lost. It's every
Mhm,
day you
mhm.
do a close reading, you do the work, like you
Yeah,
literally have to work through the text
yeah, right,
and devote yourself to it, and then at some point it clicks for more
right.
people, maybe a surprising
Yeah,
number of people. It clicks for
yeah,
them, and then
yeah.
they get enjoyment out of it. I think to return to you bring up Arthur. He's able to articulate authority. He's also cucked too, which is
Yeah,
just
well,
like he
but
doesn't solve the woman
a
question
later,
actually.
but a sort of a later
Oh, really?
part
Okay,
of it, the
that's a
story. It's real. Yeah,
okay.
I'm not saying it's non-canonical in terms of the Arthurian cycle, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's an important part. Yeah, no, I think that's an important.
So there's a mystery there, and the wonder of stories is that they can set out these paradoxes that an ideology just can't do. Like an
Right. That's right.
ideology can't
That's right.
confront, it's one of those mathematicians, Gödel, I think it was, like the incompleteness theorem.
Yeah. Yeah.
An
Yeah.
ideological way of sociology cannot confront where it plugs into something that's else, like reality, like the paradox, the incomplete. But a story can always contain that which is incomplete in the story, because like you could just have this. That's why the Bible is like so dynamic, because you're like, but then God did that, or Jesus said that, and you're like, okay, well that contradicts, and the whole like atheist, like your Bible contradicts itself, like well, you don't understand the function of a contradiction in a narrative, but.
Right.
When you get to something like liberalism, and we have these ideals, we have liberty, fraternity, equality, all of those, they just don't speak. They don't speak to a boy, they don't speak to a girl. They speak to a kind of a tetchy teenager. Like, I want to believe whatever I believe, and whatever makes sense to me. That's what I want to believe. And so it's trying to carve what it has done. What liberalism has done historically is carve out this tiny little area where people could be teenagers in perpetuity. It carved out the place for boomers. Now Gen X, we've inhabited that. Now the millennials, but every iteration of that is less and less fathered, and less, like literally less and less mothers are being produced, and less fathers are being produced. And there's more and more teenagers, and we're just like, we're filled up with teenagers.
Unattached, perpetual teenagers.
And there's no way for there's no mythological content in it, and there's nothing that you can convey through it.
Because costs are buried, right? The cost of this kind of perpetual adolescence are buried because of our wealth, and because of because because I don't know, like back in the day, if you decided at 40, after 3 kids, to divorce your husband, let's just pretend for a second that it would have been legal, what are you going to do? Like that's a recipe for suicide and murder, your own and your children. Right, if you were just going to leave, but now you can, right? And again, every time I get into this conversation, I always have to have the same throat clearing. It's like, I'm glad that women can get out of abusive relationships, obviously, or come on, but again, that's an unwillingness to deal with the costs. What has the cost been for us to be able to dissolve our marriage contracts with more ease than me dissolving my contract to lease my Jetta, right? What are the costs of that, right? And we are just so damn bad at costs. Like we're just terrible at it. It's like I was about to say something about girl math, but I'll resist. But we're just so damn bad at it, and we are given such leeway to pretend, about these sorts of things. That
there was a spicy meme that talks to this point where somebody like the first panel is tallying all the murders that men have done through wars.
Right.
Since like, I don't know, like for the 1,000 years or something, it's like 1.3 billion, and then tallying all the abortions that women have done since 1971. It's like the number's even larger than that, and it's a very terrible, it's a meme. So it's not,
but that's a perfect example of a buried cost, right?
Yeah.
And so, do you think then that like this boomer moment that we're kind of living on the aftermath of, right, as they're dying, however number of boomers are dying a day right now, right, as we speak, right? Because in, 15 years, most of them will be gone, 10 years maybe.
Yeah.
Is boomerism the ultimate achievement of liberalism? Like, is it liberalism sort of perfectly done?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you talk to the classical liberals and they argue with the online right, they eventually start doing this thing and they don't even know what they're doing because they turn into the memes of themselves, where they just start saying real liberalism has never been tried. But it was, and it was in 1995 at the peak of the boomers and at the peak and at the ascendance of Gen X, like the on-ramping of us into, we were just getting a hold of our faculties.
That's right. That's right.
And I think that was. I think there's a lot of really good things. I was living in Portland in the 2000s, and it was before it went like where it became the meme of itself. It was kind of like the Portlandia time where it was just this perfect thing. And it was before Portlandia came out, and I would walk around. I worked in daycare. I wrote my novels, and I rode my bike around, and it was this beautiful place. It was so perfect. And it started to get kind of weird because I'm like, we are so disconnected from reality and we have such strong and high opinions of ourselves. Like we're looking down at the world, look at us. And I'm like, but there's something else that we have no room to talk. It's like we're the teenager that gets online with these great, like we're teenage atheists, like today I feel euphoric because I didn't worship God, but I sipped like the best craft brew last night, the best homebrew this morning, it's like know nothing.
Perfect. Don't those plebes know anything?
John Hipster. Yeah. And having reality very slowly catch up to us and having this moment where like, you know what, this isn't going to last forever and and there's problems staring us in the face and it's not going to, the system's not going to collapse in my lifetime, but it's about to collapse. And what am I going to actually leave my children? And what are the young people who are going to live through change going to, where are they going to go and how do I influence them? How do I put things in the way that they have meaning and they have a North Star and things are valued? And so the problem with the classical liberals, they don't want to say that America is anything more than a proposition. Because that way leads war. And the reemergence, we'll see the tentative reemergence of strongmen of history on the world stage where Trump is kind of saying, so what? Vlad, Putin can do Putin, and I'm going to do me, and Europe, you're going to figure it out. That way leads war. That way leads to the conditions for manhood to reemerge itself. But do we really want hard times? Right.
Right. Yeah, I had sort of had a hope in the minutes or hours after the unmasking of this USAID thing.
Yeah.
That maybe content liberals of both the conservative and progressive variety, right liberals and left liberals, is it possible that once they see the cryptic skullduggery of the United States government since 1945 and a half, will this at all compel them to rethink the post-war achievement? And I got really excited. I read that book, Chaos, which caused me to kind of rethink a bunch of different things about the United States of America and did a deep dive into the CIA stuff and the MK Ultra stuff and, and you start to realize that the costs for me to grow up in a sleepy town in a sleepy way in the 80s and 90s was not free. Like it was not a free, like all kinds of things were going on the world stage to make sure that I could play Legos on my living room floor and ride my BMX bike around the neighborhood. Like really, right? That actually came at a cost. And it's a cost that none of us want to reckon with. And so I kind of hoped that once USAID was unmasked, that people are like, oh, well, maybe we do live in the real world and maybe, bad guys do emerge and like maybe we do have to fight, but it
maybe there are hard choices that were made.
Yeah, right. And boy,
maybe there's moral ambiguity.
Yeah, right. And therefore, we can't be scared of authority. We have to like actually embrace authority. And again, I get it.
Which means responsibility.
Right. And it's like, and I understand why Wokel and James and the gang are worried about power and all that sort of stuff. But it's like, it's like, I wrote that, it's like this myth of neutrality, that we can just kind of all just agree to, you do you, Ben,
Get along,
right?
yeah.
And I'm going to do me.
Rodney King's dream comes to fruition. Yeah.
Right. I mean, and is that all there is at the end of all of this sort of preening and posturing and carrying on? And is that all there is? Is like Rodney King kind of waving his hand, saying, "Can't we all get along?" And here's the thing: sometimes we can get along. But what happens when we don't? Yeah. What happens when we don't? And and so good. This brings me back to the daddy issues. And one of the things that I will be eternally grateful to for my own father, is like my dad was just not afraid to say no. He was just not afraid to say too bad. In fact, one of the legend stories of my father and the family is that he comes in and and he says like, all right, it's time for dinner, and I think I said, maybe my little brother said, like, well, I'm not hungry. And my dad's response is, get hungry. And it's like, my dad is just not afraid, like, get hungry. Just do it. Right. Yeah. And so there's this, like, I love that about like dadness, right? It's like dads have to say, get hungry. Like dads have to say no, or dads have to say, I don't care. Or dads have to say, go do this thing. And to me, the great dodge of liberalism is you never want your dad to tell you have to go cut your hair.
Yeah. Or make fun of you for cutting your hair in an awful way.
Right. Some sort of version of that, like that the patriarchy, right? The dadriarchy, which is really what that means, right? Is that like they have been really successful at gutting the patriarchy, and so now we're just a bunch of like teenage narcissists.
Yeah, and cat moms. There was when you were talking about the opportunity for a wake up in the wake of USAID.
Yeah.
It reminds me of that scene, the famous scene in The Matrix, where the traitor of the crew,
Cypher.
like he's eating the
Cypher.
steak.
The red steak, the steak and the red Cabernet. Yeah.
I like when liberals are presented, your entire worldview is astroturfed. Hardly anybody's actually a progressive liberal. They all want to be left alone, and they have completely different values than you. You're like, no, I'm going to continue to eat my steak. Like I'm on the right side of history. You can't say that history's fake. Like the curtain goes down. You're like, no, put the curtain back up. Like it doesn't matter anymore. Like that doesn't. And it's funny. I have family members who are. Sorry, I don't know if they'll listen to this, but they're kind of shit libs. I'm sorry to say. And there's this Bernie and AOC. They're doing this rally to smash the oligarchy. And that's literally what Trump is doing, is smashing the oligarchy. Yeah. And their resistance is just saying, no, we're the ones who are going to do it.
Right.
Like, no, you're not. You are the oligarchy. Like, you are the system. You are the system. And
cynical or dumb, Ben? Cynical or dumb? I just keep going. No, not you. I like Bernie and AOC. Both.
Yeah.
Right. Kind of in a weird way.
Oh, well,
I think Bernie's cynical, actually. It's like, what do you think it means to take down the oligarchy? Like, that's what I don't get. I don't get, like, it's like, why are you cheering for the casino? Like, Trump is actually like trying to say, hey guys, like the casino's rigged. Yeah. And a bunch of guys are like, go, the Sands, no, MGM, we're team MGM. Like, wait, they're rigging it against you. It's so bizarre to me.
It's all the narrative poison. Well, you brought up Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
What's your take on Trump as a figure? It's so interesting. He's such an interesting historical figure. It's just amazing to live in a time when this is happening. For me, I got a clock on him really early on an internal level, and I just let it go and said, this is hilarious. And then like more and more bullshit happened. I'm like, no, okay, this is actually necessary. And then I'm
Yeah.
like, just go. And now I'm like,
So
I don't know what you're doing. This is chaos. So just
yeah,
go. We'll
yeah,
see what
yeah.
happens.
So my trajectory on this has been, like ridiculous. Oh my God, like what is going on? Are you kidding me? To that's interesting. To I'm kind of pulling for you, which is weird. To you're hilarious. To like, oh my gosh, you might be historical, right? I mean, so I've kind of gone the gamut. I mean,
Yeah.
I have that Gen X part of me that I don't like bumper stickers.
Mm,
I don't even like to wear T-shirts of my favorite sports team. Like I don't.
yeah.
I don't like any of that stuff.
Yeah.
I don't have a, in the other room, I don't have a stash of MAGA gear. Um, you know, but he's significant. And only I do believe that only he can do what is happening right now. You know, like nobody else in my lifetime, no other, certainly no other Republican politician, you know, would have been capable, is capable of doing the kinds of things that he's doing, and what he's sort of jamming through. Um, you
Are you
know,
talking policy, or are you talking about the way that he is exposing the cathedral for what it is?
Kind of both in a weird sort of way. I mean, the first administration was a hot mess, and I know people who worked on both the transition team and in the thing itself, and they really truly were back-footed right away. The whole Russia thing, we have kind of memory hold that in an interesting sort of way, but that was truly passed off as real. I mean, very real. Even though I didn't believe it, it was accepted opinion that Trump was a Putin stooge, right? And that he
Yeah.
was installed and that this was a stolen election and all that sort of stuff, right? And so I think they basically did nothing and, except kind of
Mm,
make the establishment types upset, right, for the
yeah.
first one.
Yeah.
And but this time seems so different, because I think you had a bunch of people who basically simmered on their salty tears for 4 years planning on what they would do, and so now we're kind of seeing it. So I'm cautiously
Yeah.
optimistic, but I'm kind of like you. Like I've never been like a policy guy. I've never kind of done I'm more of like a symbol,
Yeah.
narrative guy. So I'm like, all right, like this is crazy. We'll see. Not that I can do anything about it anyway. So like, we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Is he terribly younger than Clinton? Are they about the same age?
They're
I don't
about the
know.
same age, aren't
Yeah,
they?
they're right. So
Feel like they're
this is another boomer. Like
yeah,
Trump, like we talk about boomers disparagingly, but like Trump
yeah,
is also a boomer. So there's something else
yeah,
going on. There's a
yeah, yeah,
flaw. There's a realization.
yeah. Yeah, I should say, like, as much as I can crack on the boomers, like I have also been on record of being like, we're going to miss them when they're gone, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I am not a millennial insofar as I just blame everything on the boomers. So you know, I don't fully blame them. I even have a video or two about this on my channel, but there is this other part of boomerism. I think you're right. Like the kind of what is it? What are the icon smashers?
Oh, iconoclasts.
Yeah, there's an iconoclastic element to this other side that, so it is a kind of like it's like the boomers that sided with the architects of the post-world consensus, and you've got the boomers who thought that was a bullshit. And so it is still a kind of war amongst the boomers,
Yeah.
but this will be the last boomer president, right?
Yeah. And then there'll
And
be a millennial.
right. And then it'll be
we'll just
millennial.
be out in the cold.
Absolutely
and then,
classic, right. We Gen Xers
40
know.
years
We
from
know.
now, we'll have one geriatric president will get shuffled in at the end of some Trump legacy.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So that's exactly right. That's exactly right. But I mean, I never would have thought this before Trump, right? But what I've come to at this point, in 2025, is that there's so much more corruption than I had ever really imagined.
Yeah.
And I don't just mean corruption like a little money theft here, a little money theft there. I mean corruption in terms of just like the CIA, and all of these this NGO network and the mainstream media and like all of these things, and I still, Ben, I don't know what you think about this, but I still can't believe that a bigger deal has not been made about the Twitter files. Truly a remarkable story that has gotten in part memory. I wonder if it's been memory hold because it's no longer Twitter, it's like now X or something. But, the fact that there was collusion between the government and not just Twitter and Facebook, but also the New York Times and the Washington Post and the spy agencies, that is, to me, that is a United States undoing event that, that just gets ignored. And so in part, I'm kind of like, Trump, friggin' blow
tear
shit
off the
up.
Band-Aid. Let's see how rotten it is. Yeah.
Right.
It's very useful. I believe that Yarvin, especially his early work, is incredibly useful at understanding a framework of seeing how the United States government has gotten to where it is right now. FDR, it's just all post-war consensus. FDR was the king. He had absolute authority over the entire thing. He set into motion the government that slowly has been decaying and spreading to where it is now. And the only thing to do is to dismantle it and remantle as soon as possible, like just an absolute capacitor, just reboot the whole thing. Now, it's not going to go down easy. The whole judges, like any given circuit judge has absolute authority over whatever the president does, that the left has fed its followers. They've made Donald Trump the end of democracy. And it's just like it's laughable just how out of touch people have become to the reality of what's going on because they're scared of losing their hedge funds, losing the system, losing their jobs. Like I work for the local school district. I don't want funding to be cut. Like it's a really nice ability that I have to work part-time and get benefits, and be connected to the community. And when I talk about destroying the system, I'm like, well, that's going to hurt a lot of lives, and I'm going to have to scramble and do things in another way. But it's so thoroughly corrupt. Like Washington is trying to ram through, the Democrats in Washington are trying to ram through $120,000 to black people specifically for their homes. Like only black people are allowed to get this money for their homes for some reason. And the Republicans are like, this is not fair. And they're like, well, you're a bunch of racists and you're basically calling me a monkey right now without calling me a monkey. They're like, well, we didn't call that. And that that still has traction. It's like, no, that should not be acceptable at all. But how do you stop that system? How do you stop any of this? And I understand that the anger at the system that can be very infectious on people that can organize very astutely and resist very astutely needs to be channeled. Like young men need to be captured and channeled, and the corruption needs to be pointed out, and the solution needs to be the path towards the solution. And I think that JD Vance is a very amazingly solid choice, just to show that a competent young male is prized and is powerful and can connect to people and show the path forward that these institutions can still work for you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. I mean,
Yeah.
this is my concern too. Um, but
But I don't
you
know.
know,
The whole
well, but
feel
I mean, it's
thing and all this stuff, you know.
well, no, but I mean, at a certain point, if the body is to continue, the cancer has to be either cut out or irradiated, and killing the cancer before it kills the body, right? I mean, like, I feel like that's all we've got, and just take your example with the direct $125,000 payment to a black person for their home in the state of Washington. I mean, like, what does money even mean?
Yeah.
You know, like, what does it even mean?
Yeah.
And what is that going to do to equity? What is it, actual equity, not DEI?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
like, actual equity. Like, what is it going to do to the housing stock? I mean, what is it going to do? I mean, wouldn't you just? I mean, you cash out, right? I mean, what is it going to do to real estate prices? I mean, what is it going to do?
Yeah. They're all
Not
going to
even
be
to
bumped up in
mention,
the poorest neighborhoods
right,
by
right,
120,000.
and so then, can you sell it? Probably not. I mean, it's bullshit equity, right? Because if you then let's just say that I own a home and I whatever I owe $125,000 on it and it's worth $400,000 and I get this payment and all right, well, I'm going to put it up for sale. Who's going to buy the thing for $400,000? Like, it's just so stupid, And so that's fantasy. It bears no relationship to the real. And there are going to be costs for that. That who's going to be there? Like, who's going to be left to kind of pick up those pieces when that bill comes due? I don't know.
Yeah.
Which is why I'm less worried about the sort of the breaking of things in Washington D.C. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Like, for instance, just the announcement the other day of the I don't know if it's the abolition of the Department of Education or if it's the sort of
That was absorbed into the DHS, my wife was saying.
So that'll be interesting because like, that's a perfect example. Like, nobody really knows that was established in 1979, and it doesn't really have anything to do directly with on the ground district state education type things. There's certain payments, I'm aware of all those kind of things, but really not that much.
Yeah.
But really the great thing that the Department of Education has done is to make college tuition really, 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 really expensive.
Yeah.
That's what it has done, right? And like, but nobody wants to admit that. Nobody wants to say that the reason why, the average cost of tuition, room, and board at a 4-year college is like 50, average here I'm talking, is $50,000. When in 1978, for if you adjust for inflation and all that kind of stuff, it's like pennies relative to the price tag. Especially if you wanted to play the in-state game, which is what it's for, right?
And multiply that against across every different sphere that the federal government has gone into. It's like,
that's right.
Scammed us.
Yeah, right. And I don't know.
Ourselves.
I scammed ourselves, right? And I'm hearing kind of like whisperings on the side that all kinds of numbers have been cooked. Right, that the way that the numbers for the economy have been reported have been cooked like massively. I'm used to hearing rumblings about this, and so my enduring question, as I do my best, like you, to watch, pay attention, observe, notice things, is what is real and what is not real. Is even more profound a question today than it was, during the COVID mess, for instance.
Yeah.
It's
or
like
the housing crisis. Yeah.
Right. It's like, what is real? And it turns out, at least from my way of seeing it, it turns out that what is real matters. It's not optional. That you can fool reality for a time, but at some point, the music stops, right? To mix my metaphors here, but it's like. There's an old Spanish proverb, and I don't know it in the Spanish. I just know it.
Fuck around, found out. I know that.
I
don't know the Spanish.
Well, I love that one. I love that. Fafo. But that's Spanish, right? No, but it's like, look, go ahead and take whatever you want, but in the end, you're going to have to pay for it.
Yeah.
And so we've been living in the front half of that aphorism for our lives.
Yes.
And as we are, in our state of life, we're like, okay, but how are we going to pay for it? Because everybody has been pretending that you don't have to pay for anything, and again, obviously I'm not just talking about money here, but I am talking about money too. How are we going to pay for this stuff? How are we going to pay for, that chart, right? You mentioned earlier the chart where, the radical divergence, ideological divergence of men and women, especially our young men and our young women. Like, that's potentially catastrophic. I mean, like, really. And especially as they've been fire hosed this kind of vision that, if your boyfriend disagrees with you, ditch him. Right. If your husband disagrees with get out of there. Like, if that's been, man, I don't know how our young people are going to get together. And
And stay
that,
together, let alone stay together.
let alone stay together, right? I mean, right, that used to be the thing, like, oh, we need to figure out how to, provide marriage counseling or whatever it is. But I mean, it's like actually just originally, from the get-go, get together. And I halfway wonder if the the what are all those folks who care about the birth rate, the neonatalist types,
yeah.
the pronatalist types. It's like, how much of that is just driven by the fact that people don't get married until they're 30 now?
Yeah.
It's like if a woman, doesn't start trying to have babies until like after 30, like, what's that window? Like, realistically?
Yeah.
2 tops? If you, and the other part is like treating a woman's body like you can just take a pill from the time you're 15 to, to 30 and then just get go off of it and then just get pregnant. It's like, well, no, the body's not a Toyota. It's a body, it's not a machine. And so anyway, I just wonder if that's also, if that's part of this whole conversation too. I don't know, man. I'm really worried about, about men and women getting along. Was it Mary Harrington a couple of years ago, sort of was posing that at one of the conservative conferences. It's like, how are men and women to get along? And as soon as she said that, it sort of lit a match or a little fire or whatever, flipped a switch in my brain. And I've been kind of obsessed with that because I realized I had been obsessed with that prior to it. She has that ability to kind of name something like, oh yeah, that's right. I've been kind of thinking about that. And again, so because I've taught millennials my entire career and now Gen Z, she's right. Like, that is the question. And my intuition is that is connected to the sort of the feminism question, which is connected to the story connection, right? These stories that form us. There's a great, I don't know if you saw it. It was banging around the internet a couple of weeks ago, but it's a Norman Rockwell image, and it's a picture of a little boy, a kind of nerdy little boy, and he's got his nose in a book. He's kind of reading this book like really intently, and then there's a little candle in front of him that is sort of throwing a shadow against the wall, and there's this image of that little boy is now on horseback, and he's got a shield and he's a knight, right? And I love that image, because I actually believe in that image, right? That our stories form our potential futures. And so I would argue that the whole decolonization of the curriculum is the culprit in many real ways. And so, you talk about scripture no longer being an informing principle. And if you talk about therefore all the stories that we have constructed and kept in circulation since, Homer and Exodus and Dante and Virgil and Dostoevsky and whatever, right? Faulkner and, all of those stories that we kept in circulation were it's like a delicate thing. And so if you sort of take that little bit of software out, to use a metaphor, like, well, what do we expect? Like, what do we expect is going to happen? Well, that's the FAFO,
yeah.
right?
Yeah. We find
You know,
proxies. I mean, Gamergate happened, at least. That
that's
shows
true.
there's some sort of latent masculinity in this
Yeah,
stage.
yeah, yeah. No, I love games. I'm actually basically pro gamer. Even though I recognize it as a potential pool of narcissus, but I like it because it excites the quest, right? I mean, I think it's the reason why
It's a
boys
proxy.
are. Yeah, that's right, and I think that it's a form of practice. My concern, of course, is it's just a little bit too good. It's like when I was a kid, and I remember getting Zelda for the first time, and that was pretty awesome. But Zelda was still 8-bit.
Chunky, yeah.
Right, and so it's like I'm not gonna, whereas man, I watch some of these games that my boy plays and his friends play. You're like, man, this is pretty damn good.
Yeah.
I could get sucked into that, pretty hard. And that's gonna be tough. That's gonna be tough
Yeah.
to get out of, I think, because at least in that space you can like sounds terrible. Like I can go kill things, right? I can go achieve things. I can go protect things. I can go amass things, and I'm not going to be shamed for like the high score.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, so it's like the fake world is more real and the real world is more fake.
Hmm.
Because in the real world at school, I have to pretend that I don't want to like make my hand into a gun and go pew pew,
Mm-hmm.
because I get sent to the principal's
Yeah.
office.
Yeah. Yeah. Kale, you
Man.
said you had a channel. Do you produce? Have you thought of producing some great course work?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, I do. Just to sort of to answer the perfunctory, I do have a Substack, yes, and I do have a YouTube channel, and I do things. One of the things I've been doing lately is sort of
You can just do things.
right. Well, right.
Look at
So
me.
I do this thing like 10 good minutes. It's like a little nugget of little 10-minute off the cuff meditation that I usually film after classes. So usually there's like an idea that kind of pops
Oh
into my
yeah.
head throughout the day,
Mm-hmm.
and then I come and I sort of just throw it. It's unedited. It's just I just literally turn the camera on, film it
Mm-hmm.
for 10 minutes, and then hit record and upload it. Yeah, I've been thinking about this because I'm a teacher, and I don't know if you knew this, Ben, but you don't really make a lot of money if you're a teacher. I know, and so
That's
I've
why
been
you go into administration work, right?
well. I
Make
did
all the
that, so
big
I did
money.
that for 12 years, and I survived, and now I'm out of that, and so now I'm trying to figure out
Hmm.
what what can I do, right? What can I do rather than go back to the administration because I don't want
Yeah.
to do that. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I've been thinking a lot about courses and online communities and that kind of stuff. So I'm trying to actively hash that out. And to your point, I think I'm trying to believe what you just said. You can just go do things, and
Yeah.
it's hard though. It's hard. I'm not. It's funny. I'm not naturally an entrepreneur.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so. So I'm trying to overcome that.
Well, I mean, just the fact that just like a reading of just reading through Homer or,
Mhm.
and interpreting that and just putting that out there. I don't know if it'd be successful or not. That's kind of a niche product, probably just a
Yeah,
few
yeah.
people, but the passion, the story there, Troy, they made a movie with Brad Pitt and
Yes, yes, yeah.
Eric, not
Eric Bana.
Badu,
Bana?
Bana. Okay,
Bana,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
And that was going around again. This is one of the best fight scenes, and I go
Yeah.
and I rewatch that show again. They did really well by the source material,
Yeah.
And I'm a cinemaphile, kind of
Yeah.
amateurishly.
Yeah,
But
I
there's
loved your
something about this.
conversation with George. Y'all were talking about all kinds of great stuff.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was
That was
surprised,
great.
but he was
Yeah, like the
so
whole time
into
because I listen to
TV
these things. I listen, and so I'm, going on my walks and my runs
pattern.
and
Yeah,
putting around, and I'm like, man, I want to jump into that conversation. That's a good conversation.
yeah,
Uh, yeah, stories you keep sort of going back to those, like for
yeah,
whatever reason.
yeah,
Um, but what's just real quick, what's amazing is how quickly like the It show or the It movie just goes away after about 18 months. As a teacher, I'm dealing with
yeah.
15-year-olds through 18-year-olds thereabouts, right? And it's like I blink and then they don't even know, like none of them, they have heard of Game of Thrones. None of them see Game of Thrones,
Yeah.
right? They've heard of Breaking Bad, a few of them. Maybe have an older brother or sister, you know, have seen, you know, so it's just, they go in and out of that sort of window of consciousness so quickly
Yeah.
that, man, it's remarkable. It's
Oh, wow.
remarkable.
Yeah. The cultural, just the
Churn.
cultural landscape. Yes. Churning so fast. And
Yeah.
so it is very shallow.
Yeah.
And then it's totally disconnected. I brought that up with one of my conversations, just talking about
Yeah.
the meaning crisis and just the breakdown between father and son over the course of the last 80 years, just on a cultural level. Like, what are we even transmitting? And then how do we work through our traumas, you know, and like the stuff that we give to our, the fucked up stuff that we give to our kids, we can't even talk to about because we don't have a story that can help them.
And so again, I
perpetual
think,
daddy
like
issues.
to your, yeah, well, I would say, you know, that to me, that's the sort of the classic, the problem with liberalism is that the problem with liberalism is time, right?
Time.
What I mean by that is that, you know, I was once a young man and now I'm an old man, right? I was once a young man without children and now I'm an old man with growing children, right? It's amazing. Like I missed the whole aging thing when I was going through it, but now as a dad, and I'm watching my son has gone from like, you know, 4 foot nothing to like he's like up here on me now, you know, and he's a freshman in high school, and it's like, holy, you know, what, you know, it's really hitting me. You know, aging and growing in time have hit me in a much different way now that I have something to market with, right? But when I was 25, I remember this. Somebody asked me when I was 25 how old I was, and I blinked and I said 22. I just remember that, and then I laughed at myself. I was like, Kale, you're 25, right? But I had nothing going on. I had nothing going on, you know, between 22 and 25 or 25, you know what I mean? It's like, I wasn't married. I wasn't even really dating anybody. I mean, I watched movies, I read books, you know, there's nothing to judge it by, but now it's just so different. It's just so different. So anyway, to connect it to liberalism, it's like liberalism works when you don't have kids, you know, because it's like, you can all kind of sort it all out. All right, you know, you stay over there and you do your thing, and she's going to stay over there and do her thing. I'm going to stay right here and do my thing. But as soon as you introduce future into that arrangement, it's like, right, you know, and it's like, we're just not good with dealing with it, you know. So it's no wonder that, you know, sort of the low key fuel of liberalism is childlessness, you know, and perpetual adolescence.
Kale, we got to wrap up the conversation. Great conversation. I'm going to link to your work down in the description, but I guess people are going to know what to find and when they get there. But give it a little precise again about what your work is.
Yeah. So my Substack's at, what is it? kalezelden.substack.com. You can just Google my name or YouTube my name, Kale Zelden. I do a lot of stuff under this title, The Underneath, which is sort of the name of my Substack and what I do with my YouTube stuff. So yeah. And I am an X lover. I love Twitter. I do.
Yeah, so you do.
You can always find me on it. I do love it. I am, you know, it's like, it's kind of my thing. And I'm an unabashed lover of X. So,
you know, I use it to connect, and sometimes somebody will turn me on to somebody, you know, to talk to, and I'm like, well, I'm not going to get to it now, so I'll follow them, and then I'll put notifications on, so it'll just keep on reminding me. And I've had you on notification for like 2 years now. Like whenever you post something, I just see like Kale Zelden is like, you're just like one of the like 5 people that for random.
Oh yeah, that's
I'm
like
talk to this guy.
I'm honored, Benjamin. Like this is that's real stuff right there, man. That's right. Yeah, and I do like it. I do. For me, it helps me get stuff off the top of my head.
Yeah,
right. It's like I've got an idea, get it out there, and sort of use it almost like a notebook. Where people can then yell at me, which is kind of fun.
Yeah,
so, you know.
A little pressure valve, and then you get pressure back, and then you can check
refine
yourself.
That's right.
Fafo.
That's right. Fafo. From the Spanish, meaning.
Oh. Kale, it was an absolute pleasure. You are going to be at the Midwest area here. That was another thing that prompted me talking to you with Paul Vanderklay, Jonathan Peugeot, and Jean Vervaeke, three wonderful guys. And you're going to be one of the headliners there.
I think I'm going to be performing in some sort of like MC role, but it's going to be in Illinois, just outside of Chicago, and I believe at the end of August. I can put the link here in the bottom of the show, but I'm really looking forward to that. Love Paul Vanderklay. I know you've had a couple of conversations with Paul. He's a real one. He's a real one. Truly. But he's a great guy and a great little thing he's got going there. So, you should come to the Midwest area.
I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about it. Paul, every once in a while, Paul will do something on one of my videos and he'll bring it into his videos. And maybe this video will get in there.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe we'll get a Paul video. Maybe
we'll get the home, they call it, in this one corner, they call it the homeroom treatment. So maybe we get a little homeroom
TLC.
treatment.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, cool.
All right, brother.
Kale, I'm going to end the recording. Thank you very much for joining me, and I'll hope that people get turned on to you and go see their work.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Benjamin. Take care.
All right. Cheers.